My name is Vitaly Chernetsky. I teach Ukrainian language here at Columbia University, and I'm going to be chairing this panel. It's no secret that the subject matter of this conference really is, in the final analysis, pertinent to what is going on in Ukraine. And it's an attempt to make sense of Kharkiv as really a representation of Ukrainian history, Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian identity, both in a kind of a historical plane. That's why we started in the 1920s, and with somebody who may be taken, and I mean Yuri Shevelyov, as a figure that represents dilemmas and challenges that modern Ukrainian identity has faced over many decades. And so this is the kind of a logical arrival point of our conference when we are going to speak about Kharkiv in the post-Soviet period. And we have a panel of distinguished participants and presenters, and it gives me distinct pleasure to introduce to you our panel. I'm going to go one by one, and I'm not, just to spare the time, you have the biographies of our presenters, so I will just mention the affiliation. So the first will be, is Tatiana Zhurzhenko, and she is from the Institute of Human Sciences in Vienna, Austria. Welcome.
Thank you. I hope you can see enough on the screen, yeah? It's not too bright. I'm very grateful for being invited to this very interesting conference. Actually, I think first in my life, which is devoted solely and explicitly to Kharkiv, my hometown, where I spent most of my life. And I must say, during the last year, I developed a very special kind of relationship to my home city, Kharkiv, because of obvious reasons. So it's a pleasure for me to speak here about the topic of my research for many years, memory politics, and today I will talk about memory wars in post-Soviet Kharkiv, focusing on the last decade. And as a social scientist, I will address our topic from a different perspective, not from how issues of history, memory, and cultural tradition we discuss at this conference matter for today's Kharkiv, with its political, cultural, and territorial status as a Ukrainian city contested and endangered more than ever before since 1991. A closer look at the local conflicts around collective memory and identity in Kharkiv, especially during the last decade, reveals the origins of the current political polarization and instability in the city, which makes it an easy target for Russia's hybrid war. Moreover, such a close look helps us to understand that despite their local scale, these conflicts largely reflect center-periphery relations between Kharkiv and Kiev, as well as the city's geopolitical location at the border with Russia. Before I start, probably I should note that for the sake of coherence of my talk, I will focus on memorials and monuments and leave aside other aspects of memory politics, for example, such as city toponyms, public celebrations, and memorial days. So what are the structural reasons, driving forces, and local grounds for Kharkiv's memory wars? In the following, I would like to focus on three aspects. First, plurality. Don't know how. First, plurality of symbolic resources. Second, local sources of political pluralism, conflicts, and political polarization. And third, the city's borderland location. Speaking on the first aspect, I would like to pick up main points of Vladimir Kravchenko's presentation today in the morning, when he actually underlined the plurality and variability of symbolic resources. If we take the past as a symbolic resource, then resources available in Kharkiv, available for constructing local history and identity, they are very different, and they provide material for alternative versions of local history and identity. On the one hand, Kharkiv appears as a Ukrainian city, the capital of the historical Sloboda Ukraine, a birthplace of modern Ukrainian nationalism, the cradle of the cultural revival of the 20s, as we heard today, and the place of martyrdom of the Ukrainian cultural elite. On the other hand, Kharkiv used to be one of the most important industrial and academic centers of the Russian Empire and later of the Soviet Union, a socialist city proud of its working class tradition, and of course the first capital of Soviet Ukraine. So there were times when the local political elites in Kharkiv tried to integrate these diverse symbolic resources into some kind of local version of Ukraineness. The almost official city brand Первая столица, Persha Stolitsa, first capital, which claimed the legacy of Soviet cultural modernization and industrialization, was such an ambivalent construction. Kharkiv as a first capital appeared as part of Ukraine, of course, but this was a particular quasi-Soviet version of Ukraineness, which implicitly opposed to the perceived nationalism of Kiev, as actually also Vladimir Kravchenko mentioned in one of his publications on Kharkiv. However, when political polarization started to prevail both in the country and in the region, as it was after the Orange Revolution, for example, these different symbolic resources became involved in constructing two alternative, even mutually exclusive versions of collective memory and identity. And with the Euromaidan and the fall of Yanukovych in February last year, the political polarization reached yet another dimension, as the territorial integrity of Ukraine was contested from within and outside the country. Alternative versions of Kharkiv history and identity have now far-reaching political or even geopolitical implications. The Russian leadership practically claims Kharkiv as one of the centers of Novorossiya. Kharkiv journalist Konstantin Kevarkyan, one of the creators of the first capital brand, went into the opposition to the new Kharkiv, new Ukrainian leadership, and as far as I know, eventually left for Russia. In February, the separatist Donetsk People's Republic adopted a memorandum declaring the republic to be the legal successor of the Donetsk Kryvyi Rog Soviet Republic and claiming Kharkiv as its historical capital. Thank you. Moving to the second aspect, I would like to talk about local sources of pluralism and political conflict and political polarization. They create the ground for the memory wars in Kharkiv. Ideological pluralism has been an important feature of Kharkiv public life since Perestroika, thanks to Narodny Ruch Memorial and the Kharkiv Human Rights Group, which gave rise to the liberal, democratic, pro-Ukrainian milieu. Kharkiv, however, has been a breeding ground also for non-liberal forces, both Soviet nostalgic and pro-Russian, as well as Ukrainian radical nationalists. The infamous pro-Russian Oplot and the Ukrainian far-right Patriot Ukraine are both Kharkiv-based organizations. Even more important have been economic sources of political pluralism, various local business groups with their competing interests and political ambitions. Unlike in other regions, there was no one dominant oligarch in Kharkiv like Akhmetov in Donetsk. Even during the Yanukovych presidency, the Party of Regions failed to establish full control over the local business. And of course, political opposition in Kharkiv would have been impossible without this pluralism of local economic interests. And finally, the Ukrainian political system, which gives Kiev a strong leverage over the regions, also reproduces political conflicts. The Kiev leadership often seeks to influence identity politics on the local level via regional administrations. And this was the case during the Yushchenko's presidency, who made the regional administrations responsible, for example, for his ambitious Holodomor commemoration project. In Kharkiv, this led to a conflict between the regional administration supported by the local pro-Ukrainian organizations on the one hand, and the city and oblast councils dominated by the Party of Regions and representing the silent majority of the local population. This was personified as a conflict between the head of the regional administration, Arsen Avakov, and the mayor, Mikhail Dobkin. The structure of this conflict, regional administration versus city council, and the mayor, Gennady Kernes, is reproduced today, though with a much higher level of intensity and polarization. And now the third aspect of Kharkiv becoming a site of memory wars is its borderland location, its closeness to Russia, and of course Russia's interest in Kharkiv. The concept of borderland identity, which allows for playing with postmodern values such as hybridity, bilingualism, and cultural ambivalence, has been reinvented and politically exploited by the local elites since the end of the 90s, when Kharkiv was proclaimed the capital of Ukrainian-Russian cooperation and a Euro region with the neighboring Russian Belgorod was created. After the Orange Revolution, Moscow supported a number of pro-Russian organizations in Kharkiv specialized on anti-Yushchenko's actions, including protests against Ukrainization and the heroization of the UPA and Stepan Bandera. Local bosses of the Party of Regions found support in Russia for their resistance to Yushchenko's politics of memory. So Kharkiv, due to its borderland location and ambivalent identity, has become a site of the Russian cultural political expansionism. In the following part of my presentation, I will talk about three different periods in the post-Soviet history of Kharkiv, illustrating them with examples of memory conflicts. So the first one is the so-called Orange era. The second period reaches from the victory of Yanukovych in 2010, more specifically in Kharkiv, with the appointment of Mikhail Dobkin as the head of the regional administration and Gennady Kernes becoming the mayor of Kharkiv, to the Euromaidan. And the third period starts with the Euromaidan and with the fall of the Yanukovych regime. So, in the 90s, Kharkiv actually, unlike Lviv, avoided what Polish sociologist Mariusz Czipczynski called post-communist landscape cleansing. This means desovietization and nationalization of the urban space in Kharkiv was fragmentary and incomplete, and counter-memories appeared rather in the form of enclaves surrounded by the Soviet commemorative landscape. So two probably most significant examples of these enclaves of counter-memories is the Ukrainian Polish memorial to the victims of totalitarianism in Kharkiv, and the second, I think very important, is the Молодежный Park, the youth park, which became a kind of local pantheon of the Ukrainian victimhood. But this situation was challenged by the Orange Revolution and Yushchenko's revolutionary memory politics, aimed at redefining the Ukrainian nation by reevaluating historical memory. Yushchenko and his allies sought to get rid of Soviet symbols and myths, understood as artificial, imposed imperial memory, and hoped for a revival of true national memory. And here the issue of the Holodomor, now officially interpreted as genocide of Ukrainians, and the rehabilitation of the UN and UPA and its leaders were politically highly controversial and dividing. In Kharkov, these revolutionary intentions of the new Kiev leadership faced the consolidated resistance of the local party of region's bosses. And here I would like to remind you about two most significant conflicts of this era. It was a conflict around the new memorial, Holodomor Memorial, erected in 2008 at the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the famine, and the memory was around the UPA Memorial Stone in the Youth Park. So the first conflict, I actually wrote an article about it, Capital of Despair, and here I don't want to repeat myself, just would like to remind you a few aspects. In this case, the place of the Holodomor in the national memory and its integration in the urban landscape became a subject of political fights. The regional organizational committee led by Avakov believed that the new memorial to the victims of the Holodomor deserves a location at the heart of the city to fulfill its symbolic and educational role. The opponents, the mayor and the city council, on the contrary, proposed to erect it in the countryside, which, in their words, had suffered most from the famine. So the city council did not give its official permission for the construction work inside the borders of the city. And the Holodomor Memorial was built at still another place at the outskirts of Kharkiv, near the highway to Moscow, and de facto outside of the borders of the city. While the conflict had a local dimension, the trigger was an order from Kiev, the initiative of the presidential administration. And as the former capital of Soviet Ukraine and one of the regions severely hit by the famine, but even more as a stronghold of the Party of Regions, Kharkiv was important for Yushchenko. The new memorial in Kharkov was supposed to reflect the role of the city in recent Ukrainian history, but even more important, to teach the local anti-orange elites a lesson. Unlike the conflict around the Holodomor Memorial, which was elite-driven and reflected traditional tensions between Kiev and Kharkiv, the second case, the fight around the UPA Memorial Stone in the Youth Park, was largely a conflict from below, involving pro-Ukrainian activists and nationalists versus Soviet veterans and communists. And the trigger of this conflict was the decision of the city council to remove the memorial stone. I will skip the details of this conflict because I will try to trace somehow the history of the memory was. These two examples actually demonstrate that the marginal status of the alternative memories, which had not fit into the Soviet commemorative canon, did not change after the Orange Revolution. Moreover, Soviet symbols and monuments were largely left intact despite the decree of the President Yushchenko from 2009, ordering the dismantling of memorials and memorial signs devoted to persons involved in the organization of the Holodomors and political repressions. So the second period, 2010-2014, was a period of an ideological backlash of the Party of Regions and of relative political stabilization. Having consolidated its power in Kharkiv, the Party of Regions did not need populist Soviet nostalgia and aggressive anti-nationalist stance anymore, at least to such extent. At the same time, the modernization of the urban space in the wake of the Euro Championship became a new priority of the Kharkiv authorities, even if they were mainly preoccupied with the opportunities that this event opened for personal enrichment. In the process of the renovation of the city center, some Soviet monuments which did not fit into the European image of Kharkiv were removed without much noise. For example, the monument to Maxim Gorky did not return to its place after the reconstruction of the Gorky Park. The probably most significant Soviet-era monument, except for the Lenin statue on Svobody Square, was the monument devoted to the heroes of the October Revolution at the Constitution Square, known in Kharkiv as the Five Carrying a Fridge. You can see it here on the photo. It was removed despite the protests of the communists. Instead, the Kharkiv authorities commissioned a new monument to Ukrainian independence, which was erected at the same place. This absolutely conventional historicist-style female statue represents Ukraine as a Nika, the goddess of victory. According to Dobkin's and Chernetsky's aesthetic taste, the new Kharkiv urbanism stylistically draws on Orthodox and Russian imperial symbols, historicism, and populism. Remember famous benches from Chernetsky, which became a symbol of corruption in Kharkiv. Ilya Kalinin's notion of nostalgic modernization, which he applied to the Medvedev era in Russia, describes this policy in Kharkiv very well. Soviet memorial sites were either silently erased or renovated as a kind of benevolent gesture towards Soviet veterans. In the depoliticized post-Soviet commemorative landscape, the remaining Soviet memorials simply turned into cultural heritage. In the wake of the Euro Championship, the pragmatically motivated Kharkiv authorities could even afford a gesture of demonstrative reconciliation between the East and the West. Dobkin and Chernetsky accepted the personal request of Lviv Mayor Sadovy and agreed to restore the memorial plate dedicated to the Greek Catholic Bishop Josip Slepy, who, after Second World War, spent some time in one of the Kharkiv prisons, and before this memorial plate was actually destroyed 2 times. The most recent episode of the Yuri Shevelov's memorial plate shows, however, that the political conflict which had split Kharkiv elites and public after the Orange Revolution is still there. It is rooted in the 20th century collective memory of Kharkiv and in the Soviet mythology of Second World War, which stigmatizes any form of Ukrainian nationalism as fascism and reduces any anti-Soviet activity to a collaboration with the Nazis. During last year, this anti-fascist discourse proved to be an especially powerful instrument of anti-Ukrainian mobilization. The conflict around the memorial plate to Yuri Shevelov whom the Kharkiv authorities denounced as Nazi collaborator, can retrospectively be seen as a prelude to the so-called Russian Spring, the pro-Russian revolt against the alleged fascist junta in Kiev. Again, I will skip the details of this war around this memorial plate, which you surely still have in mind. And I will move to the third period, which I like to address. The Euromaidan opened the new revolutionary phase, but unlike the Orange Revolution, which was largely the elite-driven protest, the Euromaidan was a mass protest movement from below. Therefore, the initiative in memory politics also shifted to the streets. In December, the Lenin statue was December 2013. The Lenin statue was toppled in the center of Kiev, and the wave of the so-called Lenin fall, Leninapad, went over Ukraine. Initially symbols of communism and Soviet regime, Lenin's statues stood for radical protesters as landmarks of Yanukovych rule, based in their view on neo-Soviet pro-Russian political values. In the East, however, Lenin monuments did not fall so easy, and so was the case in Kharkiv. After the events of March 1st, there was the first attempt to topple the Lenin statue. However, communists supported by the pro-Russian activists organized around-the-clock guarding of the monument. From the perspective of the pro-Russian protesters, these were the banderists and nationalists from Kiev and Western Ukraine who wanted to destroy our monuments and steal our past. So Lenin monuments thus have become a main site and symbol of pro-Russian mobilization, actually an empty signifier which carries almost no ideological value, except maybe for communists, but mark local identity as being anti-Kiev. Kharkiv Euromaidan was split on how to deal with the Lenin monument, and there were moderate and more radical forces inside it. And today, many, actually I was in February this year, was in Kharkiv and talked to some of the participants of these events, and still many people think, even among the Euromaidan activists, that it was done in the wrong way and undermined the credibility of the new authorities. One of the local initiatives in Kharkiv called Dialogues on Reconciliation and Reducing Polarization in Kharkiv addressed this issue at one of its first meetings. And nevertheless, it is difficult to imagine the Lenin statue back. His place is empty for almost half a year, and the plinth wrapped in green plastic fencing carrying the sign, "Dear Kharkovits, please pardon the construction underway," signals that what looks like a temporary solution is probably something quite permanent. Euromaidan, so I'm now coming to conclusion, Euromaidan revolution finally at least started to fulfill the agenda of the Orange Revolution and the Yushchenko's government, desovietization of the urban landscape, albeit in a radical, violent way. This radicalism was probably a reaction to the unlawful, violent actions of the local authorities, as it was in the case of the destruction of Yuri Shivilov's memorial plate. Some other monuments, such as the Postashev monument, were meanwhile dismantled. However, the question how to channel these revolutionary actions into lawful policy remains open. How to create a platform and open public space where the future of the Kharkiv urban culture and commemorative landscape can be discussed. The main obstacle is remaining political polarization, the persisting threat of the pro-Russian separatism and the Russian intervention, relative weakness of the pro-Ukrainian political forces. Meanwhile, however, a new commemorative culture, the cult of the heroes of Maidan and the heroes of the war in Donbass, emerges spontaneously, largely from below. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I don't know how to exit.
So our next presenter is Vitaly Chernetsky, professor of the University of Kansas. And his presentation is called The Kharkiv Text of Post-Soviet Ukrainian Literature and Its Context. And he is the leading specialist on what he's about to say. Take my word for it. Welcome.
Just a second. First of all, thank you, Yuri, you're being too kind, but it is indeed a distinct honor and a great pleasure to be addressing you here at this panel. And like several of the fellow presenters at this conference, I will start with a brief reminiscence about Yuri Volodymyrovich Shevelyov, whom I met in 1996 and had a privilege to speak with and visit in his apartment on a number of occasions. He was a remarkable man, a very active person. I remember even at many occasions bumping into him on the streets where he was coming home from going to see independent European cinema at the Lincoln Center. So this is a person of many diverse interests, not just language and literature, not just Ukraine. He was in many ways truly a citizen of the world. But to me, especially as somebody who works on contemporary literature, his dialogue and in a way becoming a surrogate father figure blessing into the world two of the major post-Soviet era Ukrainian writers, and I mean Yuri Andrukhovich, whose birthday happens to be today, and Oksana Zabushko, is very, very important here. He famously wrote prefaces to books by both of them. He was in regular touch with them. In the case of Zabushko, we know, of course, of the correspondence that she edited and later published. But I think back also to the title of his third volume of essays on literature, which is called Ne для детей, in which he himself suggested translating on the literature suitable for adults. In other words, one of the underlying thoughts and challenges was to take the readership and the culture, in this case Ukrainian culture, out of the infantilization that was imposed on it by the totalitarian system. Because as we know, totalitarian societies infantilize the adults. The adults are deprived of agency, of independent decision-making, of thinking critically for themselves. The thinking for them and decision-making for them is done by the state apparatus. So a rebellion against that and challenging that through literature and culture, and by creating this literature suitable for adults, is, I think, a very important message that Yuri Volodymyrovich left for us, and I hope we can indeed be worthy of it. So moving on to our topic, what do I mean by the Kharkiv text? The idea of cities and literature and a particular variety of literary texts and literary discourse associated with the cities is nothing new. One can talk, going as far as back as ancient Greece and Plato's Republic as the idea of what a city is and how we talk about cities. However, if we look at modern culture, our distinct discourses on what cities are and what do they represent for literature coalesces in the 18th century with the Enlightenment era and nascent industrialization around two great cities in particular, Paris and London. So these are the two European cities that are paradigmatic cities for urban discourse. However, even though lots has been written about these two cities in particular, there has been a dialogue and a lot of reflection on how this discourse ends up spreading out and impacting other places. Here in New York City, of course, but also Berlin and Vienna and St. Petersburg, famously. And in Ukraine, if we talk about distinct discourses about individual cities with their face, with their identity, there are 4 cities that have the most developed discourses. Kharkiv, of course, is one of them, and the other 3 are Kyiv, Lviv, and Odessa. So these 4 cities are the ones about which we can talk about the most sustained and established discourses. We can also talk about others. Chernivtsi, for example, has a great literary discourse and a place around it. Or even Dnipropetrovsk, for example, both in the Cossack heritage, or then Domontovich writing about it in Bez Gruntu. But so when we look at the scholarship on cities and literature, there has been new interest, in fact, a revival of interest into what is the literary discourse of the city, how cities are presented in literature. And in fact, the new Cambridge Companion to the City in Literature was just published in October of last year. So it's a big comprehensive volume, very interesting, that I strongly recommend to everyone. And perusing its pages, you can find out that there are several key themes that emerge and that I would argue apply not only to Paris, London, New York, or Vienna, but very much apply to cities in Ukraine and to Kharkiv in particular. So one of the famous themes associated with the cities, of course, is the flaneur, that comes from Charles Baudelaire. That is a person, an intellectual, who wanders around the city and tries to explore it, go into the wrong neighborhoods, transgressively enter places where he or she is not supposed to be, and to become reinvigorated as a result. We see this happen in the works of Khvylyovy, for example, and I think Sentimentalная история, a sentimental story, is a brilliant example of the depiction of Kharkiv in the 1920s, which partakes a lot of these discourses, and it's very much actually presents the city on par as an equal to the great Western cities of the 1920s. It's a city, as we know, and we have just heard from my colleague Tatiana Zhurzhenko, is also about politics of memory, about spectatorship, about desires of various kinds, about utopian and dystopian motifs, about different times. Daytime cities and nighttime cities are very different phenomena. And it's also a clash between traditional and avant-garde cultures, modernities and its rethinking in post-modernity, colonial legacies and post-colonial situations. Cities, big cities in particular, are very much associated in modern times with immigrants, with migrants, with new populations. It's not just leaving one nation to go to another, but also the rural to urban upheaval of which Ukraine very much was a part in the 20th century. Cities are also more hospitable traditionally to minority cultures and minority identities and representatives of various diasporas. This applies to New York, this applies to many other great cities, and to a greater or lesser extent, it applies to cities in Ukraine as well. And we can see that to some extent in Kharkiv, and how it plays out, I would like to explore a little more. Also, of course, in Slavic studies, there is a discourse, the city texts and literature, and this was introduced by the Russian literary scholar Vladimir Toporov and his research on the so-called St. Petersburg text and literature. This is a term that he coined in the early 1970s. And what is interesting, of course, is that we see the boom of the talk about the urban text in Russia and other post-Soviet countries that very much goes out of Toporov. So we have cookie-cutter productions of Moskovsky text, Permsky text, and other places. I mean, I have nothing against the cities of Moscow or Perm, but they very much follow into one paradigm, internal paradigm of what had developed in Russian studies in Russia, and is not necessarily an open dialogue with urban studies and the understanding of city and literature that we see in the work of people like Franco Moretti, for example. So I very much hope that in Ukraine we avoid these kind of things. Also, bear in mind is that when we talk about the city discourses, it does not necessarily have to be that we have a stable and continuous literary tradition. Just the fact that our three panels today look at the Romantic era, the 1920s, and the post-Soviet period means that there were ruptures, there were discontinuities. But that is not necessarily harmful for the city text and the mythology that arises out of the city text. My city of birth happens to be Odessa, another major city in Ukraine, and that city has a very powerful myth of its own that rests just on two brief periods. The Romantic era and the early 20th century. In fact, Odessa did not experience the kind of explosive literary rebirth that Kharkiv, for example, experienced in the post-Soviet period, and we Odessans are jealous. I mean, there are good writers who work in the city, but they have not been able to constitute a new critical mass. And so Kharkiv text is unique and fascinating in its multifaceted nature and its multiple ruptures. And what to me makes it particularly interesting and particularly unique is that it's some of the aspects of the city's identity that have already been mentioned. The fact that it is indeed a city at an ambiguous position, a city in transition, where we find a clash of traditional and rural identities with an amorphous modernity in the process of becoming. Yes, industrialization, yes, working class, but a very recent working class. It's also a city that continuously balances on the edge of hope and tragedy, as indeed works like Hvuliveza's Sentimental Story very much thematizes. For much of the post-World War II Soviet period, the fourth Kharkiv, of which Shevelov spoke, found its presence on the cultural map of both Ukraine and the larger world significantly diminished, with only some isolated fragments living on through memory, through relatives of great people. So, for example, we knew that Varyan Pitmohilny's sister was a professor in Kharkiv, or we knew that other relatives or other Gulag survivors had come back. And two Gulag survivors in particular, who I would like to highlight as very important to the city's literary culture, were two poets, very important, one Ukrainian, working in Ukrainian, Vasyl Misik, who is especially famous as a great translator of literature, but also was an original poet in his own kind, and of course, Boris Chichibabin, who in the opinion of many people, was the conscience of Kharkiv, and a person who, while a representative of Russian language culture, had expressed distinct solidarity with the oppressed, both with the Ukrainian oppressed culture and with other minorities, for example, the Crimean Tatars. So we have examples of these kind of people and the circles around them, but indeed they were small and isolated, and therefore all the more remarkable and explosive and fascinating is the flourishing of innovative writing in post-Soviet Kharkiv. We are fortunate, actually, in the case of Kharkiv, to the degree that we do not have in many other cities, that we do have a roadmap, a comprehensive mapping of the literary landscape of the city that was produced together by two poets from the city who themselves also are literary scholars. And I'm speaking here of Rostislav Melnikov and Yuri Tsaplin, and their 2007 article, The Northeast of the Southwest, on the contemporary Kharkiv literature. The article was published in Russian in Russia's leading liberal or progressive-oriented academic journal, Новое литературное обозрение, in 2007. And it is a testimony to the fact that sometimes Russian liberal identities do not stop at the Ukrainian question, as some people would put it, and indeed there are attempts made in good faith to understand the diversity of the situation sometimes. And here I want to make a very short quote from Melnikiv and Saplin's article, and I will read it in Russian first, just because hearing this said in Russian and published in Moscow is very, very important. С каждым новым усилением империи Харьков становился все менее украинским, но, что интересно, в культурном отношении не становился от этого решительно русским. А любое ослабление или демократизация империи влекли за собой очередной перманентный ренессанс украинской культуры в Харькове, причем значимый не только в локальном, но и во всеукраинском масштабе. So in English, in every new strengthening of the Russian Empire, Kharkiv's Ukrainian nature, Ukrainian character diminished, but this did not automatically make it into a decisively Russian city. However, any attempt at weakening or democratization within the empire, even before the breakup of the Soviet Union, led to yet another renaissance of Ukrainian culture, and that renaissance was relevant and important not only within the local dimensions, but in pan-Ukrainian dimensions. But of course, what this means is that we have these eternal restarts of this Ukrainian project that has to start from ruins, from the position of being repressed. So it has to start in a way with an archaeological project. Every new generation of Kharkivites who work in Ukrainian culture have to look to the past, and not recent past, but sometimes jumping over several generations to try and identify the roots and the places where they belong. And they not necessarily rebel against the forefathers and traditions, but representatives of other minority cultures. And this is one of the paradoxes. It's being a minority culture within the titular nation. It seeks out the ancestors, the potential forefathers and foremothers with whom they could identify. And as Tamara Hundarova put in her analysis of Serhiy Zhadan's first novel, Depeche Mode, many of the characters of this book, and she sees that as symptomatic to the city as a whole, are, as she put it, wounded by fatherlessness, вражені раною безбатьківства. In other words, they experience the trauma of not having the preceding generation to build upon it. All of them come from broken families somehow, all the characters. So they have to jump back to seek surrogate families and try to strategize out of that situation. Also, as she argues, this trauma makes the characters borderline autistic. It's very difficult for them to communicate and to make themselves heard, and therefore the challenge of actually breaking through this trauma is very, very difficult. And thus, when a new poetics was being born and formulated by seeking out and reconnecting with this repressed, mutilated tradition, in the case of Kharkiv of the 1990s, it first and foremost was the traditions of the avant-garde, from the futurist poetry to the performance art of Berezil. It also, importantly, meant a reaching out to other regional traditions of Ukraine. And here again we have precedents. Just as it took a son of Galicia, Les Kurbas, to revolutionize local theater in Kharkiv in the 1920s, the now legendary literary group Chervona Fira, of whose Serhiy Zhadan was one of the founding members, along with Rostislav Melnikiv, emerged in Kharkiv in early 1992, almost immediately after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And of course, Chervona Fira, the very name of the group, comes from a song by a Western Ukrainian punk rock group Brati Hadyukini, Їхала шляхом Червона Фіра, which is a great song. It's available on YouTube. If you haven't heard it, I strongly recommend it. And the song that talks about the ambiguity of transition, because what they do, they just repaint the card from red to yellow and blue. So the surface transition is what you can challenge. So one should not, as they put it in that song, sing за свиставу Козаченки на мотив наш паровоз вперед летит. So that is the danger that they are warning us of. And also, it was seen by many Ukrainian literary scholars as the analog of the celebrated Western Ukrainian literary group Bubabu. So Червона Фіра, as it were, was Kharkiv's answer to Bubabu, and just as Bubabu was very much playing with the carnival grotesque tradition. And here another interesting fact to me, this from the more recent time, the title of the anthology of contemporary Kharkiv literature that was published in 2008, Hoteli Kharkova, the hotels of Kharkiv. This very interesting anthology in its title also ironically emphasizes the perpetually provisional, deliberately uncertain nature of the Kharkiv city text. A hotel, after all, is marked by the transience of its inhabitants, yet some hotels become enduring and legendary urban landmarks. Think of the Algonquin or the Chelsea here in New York. So sometimes, speaking even more broadly, this new local poetics builds on the foundations of hybridity, cultural hybridity in the post-Soviet, post-colonial context, demonstrating what contemporary cultural theorists have called glocalization. So in other words, a combination of globalization and localization. These two tendencies blending with each other. And we see a rapidly developing and ever-densening network of interconnections and interdependencies on the one hand, and local people strategizing and trying to find their ways and their responses to it. So I'm skipping a little bit. I'm looking at the clock out there, and I want us to finish in time. So let's look at some specific examples. And my example number one will be Rostislav Melnikov, whom I've already mentioned several times. He is a poet and a scholar. He is an author of two important literary monographs focusing precisely on the Kharkiv literary renaissance of the 1920s. One on Mike Johansson, and the other one, Літературні 20-ті постаті, is an anthology, an encyclopedia, if you wish, of the great Kharkiv writers of the 1920s and 30s, from Khulevy to Svidzinski and everybody in between. And although he was one of the founding members of Червона Фіра, his own published output is relatively small, and what happens is that he is the most learned avant-garde poet. He learned the avant-garde poetics of the 1920s by book. He does not produce, though, just continuing it. He has a postmodernist ironic distance. So he tries to play with that legacy. He continues it and simultaneously gives us ironic nods to the futurists. So here is an example. And since we talked about some traumatic things, I wanted to give us a happy poem. So this is a happy poem by Rostislav Melnikov. Буває вночі інколи гарно, з вікон будинків їдуть трамваї, сліпучі плямини рожеві і п'яні посеред вулиці просто питають: «Хочете кави?» Так пахне духмяно на синім морозі джезвочка кави, і так яснооко хвилює уяву, і ви вже самі, всього лише пляма, йдете по небу, химерні та сяйні, рожевощокі і трішечки п'яні. Упадання вулиць з вікон трамваїв, сліпуча плямина, сніжина ліхтарна, і шепчете віршем, тихо і спонтанно. Буває вночі, іноді гарно. So, as you see, it's, first of all, very melodious, very well put together poem. It is also a poem that is emphatically urbanist and focused on the everyday. So it's a dialogue with that urban motifs that people like Semenko and a lot of other Ukrainian poets were bringing in the 1920s, but it simultaneously verges on the element, on the degree of parody, because it's just so sweet and earnest about it that you can sense that the poet actually is giving you a little bit of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And that, to me, is something that I find really wonderful and hopeful in the poetry of Melnikov. He's a very optimistic poet. And sadly, he has not published recently original poetry, so I hope the optimism that we see in his poetry of the 1990s is a thing of the past, and that he apparently has a new book in preparation that has been in preparation for a long time. But compared to him, our hero today, who will be speaking later this evening, Serhiy Zhadan, is characterized by a different, a complex, heterogeneous, but a strongly countercultural poetics. He is indeed, as Tamara Hunderova put in his relationship to literature, wounded by fatherlessness, and he indeed calls his home city Kharkiv in one of his poems, Misto Байстрюків, the city of bastards. His characters, fatherless and homeless, inhabit crumbling post-industrial landscapes. And Depeche Mode, especially the factory where one of its characters, Chapai, lives in one of the little shacks, and where the characters go into the management office to try to rob something, and they end up stealing a bust of Molotov, which is also in itself a very important element, where sort of you have this treasure that turns out to be a trashy Soviet piece of official sculpture, gives you the element of the paradoxes of the city. He simultaneously, though, can be a very important metaphysical poet. And since he is not here, I originally was not going to dare read his poetry to the poet, but since he is not here, I will read a very short poem also to give you a taste of an early Zhadan. This is from his collection Pepsi in 1998, and this is Tango Saltivskoy Truparni. And of course, a very shocking title. Saltivka is the largest bedroom community in the former Soviet Union, with a population of about 500,000 people. And so a tango at a morgue is, of course, a very strange thing, but here is the poem. На будинку з'являється знак запустіння, високосного року гірке насіння, залегло на бруківці, густо, мов пархи, робітничі райони, порожні парки, наче кості під гіпсом лежать під снігом, вибігає песик кульгавим бігом, підіймає в небо птахів, здіймає цілу зграю, і зграя безтямно має між січневих небес, між високих русел, стратосфери, заплівшись у чорний вузол. На будинку з'являються знаки часу, з коливанням води і горінням гасу надається можливість з відстані кроку відчувати на дотик перебіг року, відчувати на смак пульсування погоди, відчувати на стінах знак погорди, знак обіднього сну, підігрітого соку. Над будинком з'являється пильне око, повертає на північ, минувши накип, залишаючи крила, дерева, знаки. So the shocking title, the tango of the Saltivka morgue, you actually do not see either the dead bodies or anybody tangoing, but instead we have indeed a metaphysical poetry that brings nature and urban environment, but it decrowns metaphysics. It brings it in the modern post-industrial landscape, and I think this is very, very important. So this shows how wonderfully Zhadan combines many different sources, from Ukrainian futurism to the stoicism of people like Svidzinski, whom I've mentioned, to the post-traumatic brevity of Paul Celan, native of Chernivtsi, whom Zhadan has been translating from German into Ukrainian, to countercultural figures. He translates Charles Bukowski into Ukrainian, for example. And although he has not translated Frank O'Hara, I thought it would be appropriate to mention Frank O'Hara here because he is very much indebted to the New York School of Poetry and Frank O'Hara's Poetics of Personism, but mediated via the Polish O'Haraists. So there you have it, Zhadan, very much the most famous writer from Kharkiv today, somebody who reaches out to Poland, to the United States, both East Coast and West Coast, to other areas in Ukraine, to Germany, to France, to many other places around the world. So his texts are simultaneously examples of the biographical turn and the so-called new sincerity. In other words, they are very much invested in the personal experiences. And it perhaps is not accidental that his two most famous prose works, The novels Depeche Mode and Voroshilovgrad are paradoxical postmodernist odysseys. In other words, they are journeys home, journeys in search of a home. The very possibility of a successful quest of this kind in a destabilized contemporary world is simultaneously asserted and interrogated again and again. Both Zhadan and his characters never cease upon trying to embark on it and explore it. Depeche Mode in particular offers us explorations of the stream of consciousness technique, yet filtered through the workings of memory. After all, even the framing part of the novel is set in the year 2003, and it looks back at 1993, and the concomitant evolution of the authorial self. The book's emphasis on the local grounded setting, Kharkiv and its surroundings, helps Depeche Mode succeed as a participant in a global cultural dialogue by endowing with a voice a previously unrepresented identity, Eastern Ukrainian urban déclassé youth of the early post-Soviet years. The hypnotic flow of its prose contains a ringing testimony of the rise of a critically thinking self in this radically inhospitable environment, invoking a comparison with such classics of fictionalized odysseys through urban underworlds as another classic American countercultural novel, John Reach's City of Night, which was published back in 1963. So 40 years later, Zhadan does his own City of Night. I would like to conclude today's paper by briefly looking at the work of one of the prominent Kharkiv poets of the younger generation, Oleg Kotsarev. Born in 1981, he attracted significant attention already in the mid-2000s. And here, one of my predecessors, Miroslav Shkandry, talked about Dziga Vertov. Kotsarev actually developed some of his poetics by taking Dziga Vertov's theoretical ideas about capturing on camera life called unawares and transforms it into a poetic text, filtering through it both personal experiences and metaphysical reflections in one powerful lyrical whole. So the third poem of this paper. And very importantly, he also again reaches back, because this poem has an epigraph from Alexis Lisarenko, another one of the Kharkiv writers of the 1920s. Колишній будинок проєктів, Майдан Свободи. Цього теплого року нашому Харківському університету виповнилося 200. Цього місячного року одному ліфтові в нашому Харківському університеті виповнилось 33. Різні цифри, у кожної цифри своя квітка. Я вважаю, квітка має світитись. У шахті гойдаються сітки залізні, обдерті, 30-ті. Місяць жовтіє ожили, і з того боку Майдану на сітку і бібліотечні сходи лягають гарні геометричні тіні. Є люди, що висловлюються дуже приблизно. Наприклад, я відчуваю от десь тут ніби межу між моїм коханням і моїм домом. Або другий. Знаєте, напевно, в цих краях, явно десь неподалік, Австро-Угорщина злигалася з Фінно-Угорщиною. Я ж висловлююсь прямо. Так от, саме тут, точно тут, на сходах і сітці поховано чорно-білу юність на вітрі, таку нещодавню, з її тонкими твердими книжками та ще необвислим конструктивізмом. Зі сходів і незграбного поруччя витерли бруд, пищать розкидані хрестиком невидимі квіти, а останній чекіст малює у пилюці на коробці з-під цукерок свою величезну голову. Боротьба з космополітами дала реальні плоди, глибоку бежеву плитку. Марно мріють сходи із сіткою ліфтової шахти, про овальні трамваї, квадратні літери і круглі вікна. Їх не буде. Уже і місяць не стане гонгом, і не наснажить погляд на місяць. На місяць треба рушати. Кругле ж вікно є на могилі ліфтового майстра. So as you see, this poem simultaneously asserts contemporary lived experiences and goes in a very sophisticated intertextual dialogue with so many motifs of that attempt to embrace the urban and the new that the preceding panel was telling us about. So I hope that these brief highlights of the Kharkiv city text provide to us eloquent testimony to the vibrancy, energy, intellectual excitement, aesthetic richness, and dramatic insights that readers everywhere can derive from contemporary Ukrainian literature. And contemporary Kharkiv authors' defiant, emphatically articulated message, their insights into the tangle of contradictions that is Ukraine's eastern borderlands, have only been gaining significance with the crisis that has been recently precipitated with the Russian invasion. So I hope their voices will get heard. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vitaly. Our next presenter is Tatiana Zaharchenko, and she has a double affiliation, both with the University of Cambridge in the UK and the Higher School of Economics in St. Petersburg, Russia. Welcome.
Thank you.
The subject, or the title of her presentation is Between Language and Identity, the Case of Contemporary Kharkiv Writers.
Thank you, Dr. Shevchuk. I'll do this. Okay, good. 1 second. Okay. It is an honor and a challenge to be concluding speaker after my impressive colleagues' presentations, but I'm going to try to make it worth your while, these last few minutes of sitting here. In our time together today, I'd like us to take a look at a generation of Kharkiv writers I called in my Cambridge University dissertation about them the double-take generation. Double-take. These are writers who faced 1991 in a formative age bracket between the brink of adolescence and its end. So the Soviet Union collapse coincides with their youth, and they continue growing and developing as human beings in independent Ukraine. Of course, one of the foremost representatives mentioned many times already deservedly in this conference is Serhiy Zhadan, and he verbalized the intensity of their experience as follows, and this is my effort at translating his beautifully fluid prose. In that bitter and sensitive time, when everything inside of you gets ripped apart and reattached, something similar was happening around us as well, and we had to watch. So why double take? It refers to two temporally distinct reactions to a series of life-changing events, such as an imperial collapse. The initial one happens in that bitter and sensitive time, when the observer is a child. And the second glance at those same turbulent social, political events come when the person grows up. It's an act of recollection, a gesture toward the past made immediate through fiction. As people look back on their own lifetime, as most of us do. And there's theoretical background to it related to Freud and memory studies and things that I will not take time on at this moment. Now I too am a Kharkivite. I have a Western education, but my family's roots go back to Rimorska Street, which is only steps away from the Salamander House we heard about earlier. And also, I too am of the double-take generation. So what I wanted to know originally was, how do these writers, these young people who are now adults, negotiate this unique, peculiar historical experience, which really doesn't happen to everyone? What stands behind their identity? When I say the word identity, of course, I know it's loaded. Scholars have warned us, so it's sheer ambiguity. It can be a placeholder for whatever we want it to mean, so I'm going to try to use it with caution. Nevertheless, this ongoing war, which we have already mentioned several times today, has made issues related to identity, particularly national identity, rather acute. And so I turn to literature that reveals the tension inherent in such projects as finding oneself, discovering one's roots, and establishing one's authentic identity. Miroslav Shkandry, in his work on Russia and Ukraine, described this as a kind of new writing which reworks all available elements into a new consciousness and identity. Now, Professor Shkandry was talking about the older generation, Andrukhovich, Irvanets. Let's see what these guys have to say. I went and asked some of the double-take writers for input about the theme of our conference. I said, I'm going to New York, what should I say there? Now, it's hard now to catch hold of people in Kharkiv. Many of them are involved with the volunteering effort and the war effort. I did take 4 interviews, 4 viewpoints, which I've translated for you. And we can start with Yuri Tsaplin. He's, Dr. Chernetsky mentioned him as one of the co-authors of that article, together with Melnikov. Here's what he has to say. Well, there are different ways to understand the words Kharkiv, the city of Ukrainian culture. Traditional understanding goes like this. There's Ukrainian culture, and by Ukrainian culture, literature especially, they imply written in Ukrainian and surrounded by Ukrainian national myths and meanings. There's the city of Kharkiv, in which a certain amount of this culture lives and gets created. So I guess you can talk about comparing the extent of this culture in this city with general Ukrainian culture. But I prefer another approach. Kharkiv is a city in a country called Ukraine. Therefore, it is a Ukrainian city. Any cultural artifact created in Kharkiv belongs to Ukrainian culture firmly by its place of birth. Likewise, Ukrainian culture includes everything currently published, photographed, and staged right now as we speak in Sevastopol or Donetsk, including the absolute nonsense contrived by separatist-leaning graphomaniacs, regardless of what these graphomaniacs actually think of Ukraine and its culture. But then it becomes clear that the word Ukrainian here is, strictly speaking, as redundant as the word city. And maybe you guys should speak about simply of Kharkiv's culture, meaning culture in Kharkiv, Ukraine. In light of Mikhail Gasparov's idea that culture is everything within a society, what a person eats, what a person thinks, I hurry to congratulate all of us with an utterly impossible task. So there's a sense of kind of boundlessness and all-inclusiveness in his sense of what Ukrainian culture means in Kharkiv. And I was hoping we could compare it with a rather spatial sense of Ukraine and Russia for another writer, Viktor Shepelev. Here's what he has to say. For me, a Kharkivite, Russian culture is an area of general space, and Ukrainian culture of private space. In Kharkiv's creative intelligentsia, it seems many of my contacts identify with this framework. Beyond those mandatory language classes in school, discovering Ukrainian was a strange process for me. For instance, trying to be different from everyone else, you suddenly stumble upon Kotsibinsky intermezzo in the boring reading program. And this secret, this discovery, shakes you more powerfully than discovering your own sensuality at around that same age. Or in an elite Moscow almanac, you come across a little piece from Zhadan's Anarchy. Then you buy the original. Then other books by this author. Then other books from that same series. And you start writing those private, those most important poems in the semi-familiar Ukrainian language. A few years later, you discover that young college students, regulars at Kharkiv's poetic slams, who are Russophone in daily life, also write their poetry in Ukrainian and perform in Ukrainian. So Ukraine's culture, like culture of any other European country, becomes a possibility of discovering a private inner personal identity within us, while staying within a more, say, global culture, a lingua franca culture, be it Russian, European, English-speaking, world culture. It's not a boundary that limits the possibility of my expression. It is something completely different. Think of it as a hot center of attraction that we rotate around, or an orbit some of us can consciously and forcefully choose to leave. I would like to keep thinking that the natural attraction of Ukrainian culture is felt by most Kharkivites. This idea of Ukrainian or Russian speakers writing in Ukrainian and suddenly finding this inner strong voice, surprisingly, it wasn't the first time I've heard this mentioned. Another person I interviewed came up with the same concept. It was Andrei Krasnyashchik. He said, imagine left bank Ukraine, 1990s. Teachers begin to notice that students speak Russian well, but Ukrainian not so much. But students write very well in Ukrainian and increasingly worse in Russian. An older brain sorts two languages into almost two hemispheres. In a young brain, they grow together. Russian-speaking, Ukrainian-writing people think in both languages situationally. Their mind makes its own decisions about which language to them fits a particular topic. It's all been described by Jung and Levi Strauss how the world becomes chaotic, imperial collapse, how a person's mind hits a dead end and unable to escape grows dim, and the unconscious steps in. The unconscious stabilizes the shaking image of the world through progressive mediation, slowly replacing the opposites by their softer equivalents until they grow to be one. Surjik was one such intermediate period. It is possible that today's situation is not the end either. So in this piece of interview, you can see him emerging sense of things that are happening inside of him in terms of what post-colonial theorists would call hybridity. And the fourth person I'd like to conclude this part of the presentation with actually comes with a contrast. My colleague, Dr. Chernetsky, has already mentioned him, Oleg Kotsarev. Here's his sense of the two cultures. I remember two centers of Kharkiv in the spring of 2014. One was when the pro-Russian crowd and visitors from the neighboring regions of Russia took control of the central square and the surrounding neighborhoods of the city. Downtown appeared to be dead. Many shops were closed. Everyone tried to avoid the area. My second memory of Kharkiv center is when Ukrainian activists recovered from a number of bloody beatings and gathered new big rallies with adequate defense forces this time. Downtown Kharkiv in those days no longer seemed lifeless. In addition to protesters, regular, non-political people strolled the streets. They weren't interested in anything, but also they were not afraid. Stores didn't close. People walked in and out. Some waved Ukrainian flags and ribbons. Others, just recorded everything on their mobile phones. But again, owners didn't close their shops and didn't worry about their windows. To me, this difference is yet another answer to this question of whether Kharkiv is Ukrainian. So allow me to conclude again. I promise not to hold you much. So allow me to conclude by zooming out and kind of look at a timeline of cultural layers so well already demonstrated by this conference. Literature in Kharkiv was originally formed as bilingual. Kharkiv's first writers were bilingual. Sometimes they mixed languages like Skovoroda. But starting in early 19th century, the university opens, Kharkiv becomes a major hub of Russian culture, and we see periods of alternating Russian and Ukrainian ascendancy. In Kharkiv's literature scene, the previous presenter called it eternal restarts, I believe. So I will not go through the small points. That's a rough summary of things already mentioned by my colleagues. But what I want to emphasize is right now what we're living through is unique in terms of history. From the mid-90s, in the post-Soviet period, for the first time, the Russian and Ukrainian literary forces in my hometown are more or less equivalent in terms of their strength and vocalness. They're equally distanced from official culture, and they interact very heavily with each other. Writers in Kharkiv are not split along language lines. After 2000, Russophone literature in Kharkiv begins to also form its own identity. It very strongly stops being Russia's diaspora literature. It feels very strong ties to Ukraine, belonging to Ukraine, and yet tries to maintain its linguistic self, somehow to negotiate its languages and its feelings. Critics have pointed out that Russophone literature of Kharkiv comes with a purely Ukrainian drive and intellectual playfulness, without the deep sense of melancholy and nadriv, characteristic of contemporary Russian literature. I was unable to translate the word nadriv into English. It just means an permanent state of eternal terror, an internal horror. But of course, difference between Russian literature and Kharkiv Russophone literature, which are vast, is a whole separate topic. But what Kharkiv literature really demonstrates at this point, Russophone literature, is a very interesting phenomenon because, like most Ukrainians at this time, this literature itself and authors who write within it are trying to establish a voice, and their voice is fiercely protective of Ukraine and of their Ukrainian-speaking colleagues. Ukrainianness in our country is no longer defined alone by tongue or ethnicity, although of course the question of language for sure remains sensitive and complex and multi-layered. But discourse has shifted because of the war, because of the invasion, and because of the revolution. Discourse of Ukrainianness has shifted to keywords like dignity or human rights that people rally behind regardless of what actually they speak at home. So to bring us back full circle to the title slide that I used, this is Yuri Tsaplin and Andrei Krasnyashik presenting on this picture their Russophone literary almanac, Союз писателей, in Moscow. These two men and many other writers in Kharkiv, Russophone writers, were signatories, to a letter against invasion, which was very strongly phrased when the Russian forces arrived in Ukraine. And a very, very small piece, literally sentence in my translation, went like this. We, the Russophone writers of Kharkiv, want our voices to be heard. We speak Russian freely here, at work and outside of work, with our Ukrainian colleagues as well. We are citizens of Ukraine. We require absolutely no protection by another state. We do not want any nation bringing its troops into our city and into our country under the pretense of defending our interests, endangering the lives of our friends and loved ones. You can find the full text of the letter online in March 2014, I believe. So just to conclude, and perhaps we'll talk more during discussion and also after Žadan's presentation tonight, I was walking through Kharkiv just a few weeks ago and came across boys putting this sticker around its fences. I'm not sure if you can see it, but it basically says Kharkivites in Ukrainian using Ukrainian national colors and kind of symbolism. And I went and approached them. There were a bunch of young men, 20, 25 or so. I addressed them. They spoke back in Russian, and I said, well, tell me about this. And they said, well, there's really not very much to say. We're Kharkivites, we're Ukrainians, and this is our way of reflecting it, a small sticker. And perhaps I'm just going to conclude on this point that there's still much to see. We're all going to see together where Ukrainian identity is going to go, where languages are going to go, but I think we're already observing something completely fascinating and unique. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. I can't resist just saying that there was something hypnotic about your presentation. It's not scholarly, but it's meant as a compliment. Thank you. We have a healthy hour, half an hour, 40 minutes, about 35 minutes for discussion. And we're ready to entertain your questions and comments. Well, while you are gathering your thoughts, okay, Helena? And do introduce yourself. Helena Hrin from the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard. Yeah, because this is recorded, so let's speak in the microphones. I suggest that you just prepare yourself to pose the question.
So just very briefly about this poet Kosarev, is he? I have to just speak up. About Kosarev, is he in any way related to the painter or the futurist?
Well, he's called Tsarev with a letter Tse. So yes, as far as I know, he's not related. He is part of yet another trio. It seems like Ukrainian poets liked breaking out in groups of three. This happened to Bobabu, it happened to Chervona Fira, and in this case it was Oleg Kosarev with Pavlo Koropchuk and Bogdan Oleg Goropchuk. The three of them made a big splash together in the mid-2000s with a joint book called Silo Dobovo. And he is, I think, one of the most visible and vocal younger Ukrainophone poets from Kharkiv, and so he writes in Ukrainian. And he also is somebody who is, as you saw from what both my colleague and I talked about, is somebody who is very actively engaged in dialogue, both dialogue with other poets of his generation, but also intergenerational dialogue. There is a very interesting online dialogue, kind of a free-flowing interview between him and Žadan that was published 3 years ago that I found really great and very illuminating. And you can just Google in Ukrainian Kotsarev Zhadana, it will pop up. And I strongly recommend it.
Go ahead.
This is a question for Pani Tatiana. I was wondering, because this is actually a kind of spomen from 1990. I was with my lovely wife in Kharkiv. This was the last year of the Soviet Union. And what I was struck by, when the youngsters took us, it was a park that the Zhurzhenko had kept. It was close to where the Lenin's monument was, but it's off to the side. And I remember very distinctly that they were very proud of two very important things. And my friend Miroslav is here. So Kvirlevay was one, that they had finally found a spot and put a little cross for Kvirlevay in this park. And the second, I was struck by the fact that there was a row of these old marshals and generals from the Russian Tsarist times. And the kids had a really great time every week. Friday night, they took one down. Now, my question is, at this point, because you've dealt with the sort of the modern polarization, which is the legends of UPA on one side, which really isn't native to the area, and the sort of this Russia on steroids that we're getting out of Dugin and so on and so forth, Ruski Mir. But are there memories of a much more interesting and important period of time, of a Soviet Ukrainian that was very, very interesting at some point, and whose greatest sons, people like Kvirlevay, actually did some very serious work. The kids in 1990 were very well aware of him, and they were also very well aware of the sort of that these old Pamyatniki, they weren't going after the Soviet Pamyatniki just yet, but certainly the Russian old generals from the old days, you know, heroes of the Napoleonic War and so on and so forth. They thought that that's got to go. So if there seems to be even greater depth to the memory than what we give it, we've now sort of cheapened it by making it the way, I guess, the way Putin liked to see it. But are there all these other layers of memory in Kharkiv as well? Sorry.
Should I answer now?
Yes, please.
Yeah, very good question. Thank you. I actually concentrated on the last 10 years because I thought this is most relevant for the current political situation in Kharkiv. But indeed, in the end of the 80s, beginning of 90s, there was very interesting period when a lot of initiatives emerged from below, like initiated by Memorial, by some other small groups, and it was in a different atmosphere. I think when these initiatives were kind of, if not welcomed, then nobody tried to kind of repress or regulate them. So the memorial cross to the victims of the Holodomor in Kharkov you mentioned, this was actually, I think in Kharkov many believe that it was the first, actually the first memorial in Ukraine. I think one of the problems actually in Ukraine is we don't memorialize what we do with memory. Yeah? So when we destroy monuments, we just destroy them, and this is something I think we still have to learn from some European countries, where you can see, like I live in Austria and I see some elements still left from the Nazi era, for example, and these elements, they are not like erased, but they are framed in a different context. So you see some kind of, I don't know, kind of a poster or kind of played with the explanation or with some kind of artistic, I don't know, interpretation. So some elements, some from the past, they kind of, and I think it has very important educational role, because you cannot just erase the past, and you have to find the way, even if it's an ugly monument you don't want to have, but you have somehow to mark there should be traces in the urban landscape, so that people should have the memory of what used to be here before and why it was erased, and so that the landscape never like so one-dimensional as it was in Soviet times when all traces are erased. So I think it's a very good question, and we have to work on it, not only in Kharkiv.
Tatiana, I'll have to put you on the spot again. I'm curious about
Miroslava Mudrak.
Miroslava Mudrak. I'm curious about the monument to Shevchenko in Shevchenko Park. In its day, it was controversial. Is it threatened in any way by the separatists? What is the sentiment around this monument today from the Kharkivites? Do we have to worry about that monument in any way?
Thank you.
From what I know, I don't think, maybe because Shevchenko was in a way part of the Soviet Ukrainian cultural canon, and this monument was kind of also local pride also in Soviet times. I don't think it was politically controversial in the same way as other Ukrainian symbols. I think it's very interesting and very telling that the monument to Taras Shevchenko became a site of Kharkiv Euromaidan from the very beginning. You probably know that the Svobody Square was kind of fenced, and it was not allowed to enter because the Kharkiv authorities did not want like mass gatherings of people according to Kiev scenario. So they kind of closed this square, and the Euromaidan gathered every day or every evening near the Taras Shevchenko monument, and they kind of appropriated this space in a very, I think, very special kind of cozy way. So they, in the end, they also put Ukrainian flag on the shoulders of Shevchenko, and I think this place was never contested by the pro-Russian separatists.
If I can jump in with a little bit of a sort of comparative reflection, we have two very interesting tendencies happening simultaneously. Neither in Crimea nor in the Donbass, any of the Shevchenko statues have been destroyed by the separatists. In fact, in Simferopol, just a few days ago on Shevchenko's birthday, there was a big gathering of local expressing Ukrainian patriotism. There were some arrests, but the statue is still there and people were still able to gather. So we have an ambiguity here associated with the figure of Shevchenko, who has been appropriated and very much seen as a champion of Ukrainian identity. And so we have a lot of Euromaidan gatherings all over Ukraine and even outside Ukraine. But because the anti-independent Ukraine sentiment in many ways is couched in Soviet rhetoric, and indeed, as Tatiana said, in Soviet rhetoric, Shevchenko was part of the official canon. They don't have the guts or do not think that far. And it's also very interesting to see what places become sites of mobilization. So I'm thinking about my native Odessa, where a good friend of mine, a professor of philosophy at Odessa University, pointed out that the Euromaidan in Odessa gathers in two places. The Shevchenko statue and the Duc de Richelieu statue. So we have the early 19th century Odessa and the Soviet-era Shevchenko statue. Interestingly enough, there is a local symbol of Ukrainian identity, Otamarantin Holovate, and there is a statue of Holovate in a beautiful square in the center of the city. So her question is, why do not they go to the Holovate statue? You see kids playing around Holovate, but no Euromaidan. So Euromaidan goes to Shevchenko and goes to Duke. So this is, I think, an interesting puzzle to interpret for us when we look at the politics of memory and identity and strategic choices people make, why certain places and certain sites and certain recognizable monuments in cities are picked for symbolic self-expression and not others.
If you'll allow me one more, and Vitaly, this is for you. When you read Zhadan's poem, the tango and the Saltupsky Morgue, I didn't feel Semenko, I didn't feel the Ukrainian futurists, but I felt the vortices. Has anyone kind of thought about Wyndham Lewis and the vortices as...
Wow, thank you. Thank you. I think that certainly Wyndham Lewis is somebody who has not been seriously researched and appreciated in the post-Soviet world. He's kind of a taboo writer, as you know, the Soviets divided all the world literature into the clean and the clean ones, the progressive and the reactionary, and they labeled him reactionary, and therefore he was proscribed. But I think it will be very important to see. I've already seen some interesting comparative research on, for example, HD and the early imagists and early women's poetry, both in Ukraine and in Russia at the beginning of the 20th century. But I think you're definitely onto something. Thank you.
Go ahead.
I'm a short person, I don't know. Okay, I'll try this one. I have two questions.
And can you introduce yourself?
I'm sorry?
Introduce yourself, please.
Olga Botelson. Two questions for two Tatyanas. For Tatiana Zhurzhenko, the first question. Despite the fact that I am a former Kharkivite, I never had an opportunity to stop and take a close look at this monument, the Statue of Freedom, right? And you had a picture, it seems to me. And this statue is just, it seems quite unstable to me. This female is standing like this on some kind of round, right, structure, which can be read or can symbolize some kind of instability of freedom in Ukraine. So I have a question for you. Do you know the facts that perhaps there was some kind of resistance to install this kind of monument, or perhaps there was some kind of, was it a transparent project, I mean, in terms of who is gonna do this for this particular square? And the second question for Tatiana Zaharchenko. According to some information that comes from Literaturna Ukraina, the picture seems just not like this kind of rosy, because the Union of Writers expelled, basically deprived some Russian writer in Kharkiv of his membership in the Union of Writers for his speeches or publications in which he expressed some kind of ideas of separatism. So maybe some comments or some perceptions of what is happening in Kharkiv. Thank you.
This statue, which symbolizes Ukraine's independence, it was actually, the occasion was 20 years of the Ukraine's independence. And of course, it was part of the project, as I said, of modernizing the city center in the wake of, in preparation to the Euro Championship. And before this statue was erected, the first one, which was also the statue devoted to the Ukraine's independence, which was opened in, I think, in 2001. 10 years of Ukraine's independence. It was at the Rosa Luxemburg Square. Maybe some of you remember it. It was like a column with the eagle on the top of it and a girl, like 10 years old girl. It was removed. So somehow the city council decided that it's aesthetically somehow something wrong with it. So they commissioned a new one, and nobody actually understood what was wrong with the first one. Why do you have to remove the first one? And if it's like every 10 years you will build a new monument to the Ukraine's independence, I suspect actually it was like a typical Kharkiv business, some kind of some shadow kind of dividing money between right people. And the funny thing is that the author of the both monuments was the same sculptor Ridny. His name is Alexander Ridny, and he is kind of very well known in Kharkiv, and actually the author of many monuments, some kind of Kharkiv Tsereteli. So he was not unhappy with the destruction with the first monument because he was commissioned the second one.
Exactly what she planned to write, she wrote. In reality, there is no split that I can attest to. There are a few writers, such as I think Stanislav Minakov, and a few names that kind of come from a so-called imperial tradition that disagree with things that are going on, but they're kind of, I wouldn't say lone wolves, but they're standalone figures. Otherwise, there is no political or cultural split that is worth really discussing. I wouldn't call it a rosy picture. It's just a certain reaction, certain response to war that we're observing. Does that answer the question? Sort of.
I have a quick comment about that
And you
statue. Taras Kaznarski.
We are recording this. I'm not just being difficult.
Sorry for not complying right away. A quick comment about that statue. I'm tempted to read it more pragmatically and simply because to me it is a reiteration of Ukraina na Sharu in Kiev Independence Square, one of those female Victory Nike figures which have to stand on a sphere because sphere is the globe, and it's that kind of attempt to place Ukraine on a globe, an attempt to place it in a form of a female figure with wings, rats, and other, or she has some embroidered apron on the Independence Square. So it's a post-Soviet sort of revulsion of sorts, both aesthetic and ideological. That's what it seems like. I would not consider it a particularly mysterious creation there. Another question to Vitalik. I was a little bit puzzled with your notion of Jadon shunning metaphysics. And again, I might be completely wrong, I might be pushing completely wrong buttons, but what you read to me strikingly resembled to me the flow of Brodsky in a way that I know our attitudes toward Josip Brodsky and some of his statements, but the connection for me was to the notion of sublime, the sublime in a state of sort of falling apart, fragmentation. Kharkiv again appeared to me somehow, and I may be completely wrong, as that a Petersburg connection, as a capital that went through its decomposition of sorts, Soviet, post-Soviet decomposition, but the sublime is there. And it's not a pretty kind of sublime, but it is. What do you think?
Well, first of all, you're right on point. I had Brodsky written down in the paper, but I did not utter his name. There is a very clear intertextual dialogue. The difference here, and this is something that other people who have written on Brodsky, I'm thinking of Oksana Zabushko especially, is that for Brodsky it's the imperial sublime. For Žadan and for other poets actually that Brodsky felt his affinity with, and this is, Zabushko discusses Brodsky versus Derek Walcott, it is not the glorification of empire. So it's, if you wish, it's a post-colonial sublime. So what happens, we have a post-colonial rejoinder that still tries to create some sort of, paradoxical sublime out of ruins and trash, and there is something lofty and transcendent in this emphatically lowered landscape. I mean, in Brodsky it comes in places where he tries to reach out to other cultures, like «Теперь так мало греков в Ленинграде, что мы сломали греческую церковь», and things like that. But interesting enough, for Žadan, the Brodskyan period was very short. So as a way, Brodsky was one of his childhood diseases that he had an experience with and he left behind. At least that's my reading of how his poetics has developed. So it played an important part in his writing of the late 1990s, from which this poem comes. It was published in '98, but he's really gone in a very different direction in the 2000s. But yes, you are right. There is Brodsky there, but it's a Brodsky as a rejoinder. So it's a dialogue. It's a polemical dialogue with his poetics that appropriates some things and rejects others. Mm-hmm.
I have a question for Tatiana Zaharchenko, if I may. You were talking about the fact that there is no difference or linguistic division between the writers in Kharkiv. Why there, in your opinion, maybe you don't know the answer, is it because Ukrainian speaking or using writers switch without problematizing the switch freely to Russian, and Russian writers do the same thing for them? Or is this what commonly is the case in Ukraine and what I call asymmetric or pseudo bilingualism, when Ukrainian speakers are 100% capable of speaking and switching to Russian when need be, and do that, and when 96% of Russian speakers are incapable of doing the same for, when need be, for their Ukrainians, and then go and say it's not important?
An interesting question, and indeed a good point. That is not the situation I have seen in Kharkiv. It doesn't mean it's not a situation you cannot find. But certainly Ukrainian speakers, writers in Kharkiv will not switch to Russian. Rostislav Melnikov will not switch to Russian. If you address him in Russian, he will speak in his language. So will Žadan, so will Oleg Kozarev, so will Igor his last name was escaping me, I'm sorry, but it was just Zarudko. Russian-speaking writers in Kharkiv, again, perhaps this is because we're speaking of a certain elite circle, right? They are freely capable of switching, and they do switch. So I have not seen that situation happen, but I have heard people talk about it. I have heard people compare. My friend from Lviv was mentioning that there is a certain asymmetry about ability to switch. I suspect it's also linked to the fact that those who still would want to switch to Ukrainian, when you speak to them in Ukrainian, don't have the surrounding in which to practice that language in some cities still. So you switch, you make mistakes, people react differently. It grows complicated in that direction. But I do see people trying and changing.
Yes, for me a great example in Odessa, my native city, the leading contemporary poet from Odessa, Boris Khersonsky, who is Jewish by background, who has been writing poetry in Russian all his life. He's also a very famous medical psychologist. He said recently, I used to think that I had two motherlands and one language. Now I think that I have one motherland, Ukraine, and two languages. He started translating his own poetry into Ukrainian and writing in Ukrainian. He has already been a very active dialogue with Ukrainian language poets, doing mutual translation. He worked with Mariana Kianovska from Lviv, but it was a very strong and conscious step that he made. And he said that in Odessa, he will only do public readings in the Ukrainian language bookstore, in the Kniharne Kavyarnya, so not in any others. So here's an example.
Thank you. Question? No questions. I have one comment. The last thing that you showed, Kharkivianin in Ukrainian national colors, there's something happening with how Ukrainians resort to the ritual usage of colors as protective strategy against a possible invasion. When I was in Ukraine last time and traveled to Shevchenko's birthplace, to Morinci and Kirillivka, I saw entire bridges painted blue and yellow. I traveled with Podrevyansky to his place in Poltavshchina, Zapsilya. I saw entire city of Kremenchuk painted blue and yellow. I traveled to the airport to take the flight to New York back, and there were kids asking for money for paint. I asked the cab driver, what's the deal? And he says, why don't you know? Everybody knows. They are painting the fence of the Boulevard Lesia Ukrainka in yellow and blue. And to me, it brings this kind of parallel to what Gogolian Choma Brut did when he wrote a circle with chalk around himself to protect himself from Pannochka, from the evil force. I couldn't resist that kind of a parallel. Well, thank you so much to all our panelists. A fantastic presentation. Congratulations to each and every one of you. And we are looking forward to seeing and reading more of your productions. And also, I want to take a moment and express my gratitude on behalf of all of you and of the Ukrainian Studies program to Marko Andrejczyk, who conceived the idea of this conference. My head goes off to you. Keep doing these things. And I give the floor to Marko because he has something important to tell you. Thank you.
Дякую. Thank you. Yeah, and thank you on behalf of the Ukrainian Studies program. I really want to thank all the participants, this panel, today's previous two panels, yesterday's panel, for a really wonderful discussion. I'm very happy to announce that today the director of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies has asked that the presenters present their papers for possible potential peer-reviewed publication in the East-West Journal of Ukrainian Studies, which is very exciting because we had some really good papers, and I think it's a great way of making it available for future scholars interested in this fascinating topic.